session. I want to call out some of our good friends of WITA who were pleased could join us online, who you cannot see, but are here today, and it's a real honor to welcome them. Ambassadors and the former United States Trade Representatives Susan Schwab and Carla Hills. Welcome, Susan and Carla. Ambassador John Weeks, the former Canadian ambassador to the WTO and chairman of the WTO General Council. Ambassador Darcy Vetter, America's former lead agriculture negotiator. And my good friend Grant Aldonis, the former U.S. Undersecretary for International Trade, who I think celebrated a very big birthday this past weekend. Welcome, Susan, Carla, John, Darcy, and Grant, who are all pillars of the Washington and global trade community, and it's an honor for us to host you today. To close out the conference, we're going to widen our aperture and discuss the new direction for U.S. and global trade policy. I'd like to ask our panel to please turn on their cameras. We've brought together four of the most thoughtful people writing about and thinking about trade in 2025 to discuss this new direction and maybe help answer a question that I raised in my opening remarks to help us glimpse a way forward into the unknown of trade in an increasingly fragmented world. We have two old pros on the WITA stage, Ted Alden, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Ross Distinguishing Visiting Professor at Western Washington University. Ted is the author of The Future of Trade in an Era of Disruption. Stephen Vaughn, partner at the International Trade Practice at King & Spalding and a former general counsel at USTR in the first Trump administration. We also have two new speakers at WITA, Arancha González, the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po. Arancha, I wanted my daughter to apply to go there, but she didn't make that decision, so I'm a little sad because I didn't get to come visit. Arancha is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain and the author of The Next 5 Years, How Strong Economic and Trade Alliances Can Prepare the EU for a Post-America World. We're especially grateful to you for joining us so late in the evening in Paris. Todd Tucker, Director of the Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute, the lead author of the new U.S. Trade Agenda, Institutionalizing Middle-Out Economics in Foreign Commercial Policy. And our moderator, the former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative Wendy Cutler, who is helping lead the discussion of global trade policy from her perch as Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and is a frequent collaborator with us at WITA. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you. And Wendy, take it away.
Well, thank you, Ken. When you asked me to moderate this, I wasn't thrilled you gave us the last booking of a long afternoon, but I have to say the conference so far has been so interesting and so relevant that I'm hoping our viewers will stick with us for this last session. And for the panelists that I'll be discussing these important topics with, guys, the burden's going to be on us to make this interesting and lively. But given all of the issues that have been put on the table, I'm sure we will not disappoint. Our discussion is aimed at taking a step back and thinking big picture on where we are, where we're headed, and where we should be headed, both with respect to U.S. trade policy, but also the global trading system. And it's no easy feat these days, given the rapid barrage of announcements on tariffs and other trade measures. But it is important, as many of the foundations that we all grew up with and many of our viewers swore by, as well as our panelists, are no longer appropriate, relevant, or really fit for purpose. So with those introductory remarks, let's get our panel started. Unfortunately, I only see Ted Alden on the screen. Are the other three panelists here?
They're all here, Wendy. I see them all.
Okay, I don't know. I got some strange thing going. Well, Ted, just because you're on the screen, I'm going to start with you. And given that you wrote a book on the future of trade, I'm sure it's hundreds of pages. And I'm going to ask you in like the next few minutes, really to share your views on where are we headed? Because I think you would even agree that the current trading system has kind of, it's not as relevant, appropriate, or what we need today or what our domestic stakeholders are looking for. So maybe you can share with us, as you look forward, like what principles are important to pursue, and what tools do we have to pursue these kind of new thoughts or new principles in trade?
Thanks very much, Wendy, and it's great to be here with such a distinguished panel. Just to clarify, my new book actually over my shoulder there is about the future of borders rather than about the future of trade per se. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about the future of trade. I've been working on this stuff, as has everybody here, for a long time. In my case, going back, to the early days of the negotiation of the WTO. When I said yes to Ken, I guess I sort of assumed that our conversation would revolve around, well, okay, there'd be these friendshoring initiatives that have sort of grown through the Trump and Biden administration, how to end up in a stronger place in supply chains vis-a-vis China, that would be a continued theme going forward, that some of the industrial policy stuff that Todd's worked on and that the Biden administration implemented, that we would probably see that continue in various ways because it's essential to the competition with China. We would see new tariffs, but they would be strategic and reasonably targeted the way they were in the first Trump administration, probably again focused on China. I'm afraid the last few weeks has really upended a lot of my assumptions about what we were heading into. I hope I come away from this hour with a clear sense of what the strategy is, but at the moment, it seems to me to be wholly disruptive, largely aimed at American allies. And the purpose is to test here in the United States, to test the limits of the tariff weapon as a tool for making policy gains in all sorts of areas, some of them related to trade and the economy, some of them not at all related to trade and the economy, like illegal migration or drug control. So this is really new territory, I think, for all of us, because we all kind of grew up within the system of rules. So we try to think about these developments in light of the system of rules and where's this a deviation and where might we be able to put things back together. My colleague at the Council on Foreign Relations, Max Boot, who's not a trade guy, he's a security guy, had a very sharp column, I thought, in the Washington Post yesterday, saying the closest analogy to what the United States is doing now is China's wolf warrior diplomacy, where we're using the economic weapon to try to pursue other goals that are not related to trade. So maybe this is a phase. Maybe we'll settle down into an approach that'll look a little more like the first Trump term, and then we can have a more rational conversation about what that means for the future of the system. But if I had to guess right now, I guess we are entering a period of maximum conflict in which we're going to see tariffs, we're going to see retaliation, and it's going to be sort of a show of strength. I mean, the Trump administration is going to push as hard as it can, and the question is, what's the scale of the retaliation? How much do U.S. interests, farmers, and others get hurt by this pushback? And where does the dust settle? And then we figure out what's left. But I think we really, unfortunately, are headed into a period of serious conflict, not construction of some new system.
So Steve, maybe I can turn it over to you then. I'm sure you probably want to respond to some of the points that Ted made, but also I thought I would throw out the latest op-ed by Ambassador Lighthizer in the New York Times, when he talks about kind of the principle of balance being extremely important. And maybe what we need, or what he suggests, is that we set up a new grouping of democratic governments and, I don't know, other mostly free trade countries, or free, I don't know the exact terminology, you can share that with me, but a grouping that would have internal tariffs and then separate external tariffs. Can you explain that to us? Is this a good way forward, and why is balance so important?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we have to understand that this is now the third presidential election in a row where trade has been on the ballot, and for the most part, I think we now have a pretty good sense that the voters are not, they don't agree with the current trading system. They think it was a mistake, and they want to have it changed. So I think now we're sort of in the part where, under our system, we need to be thinking about how can we make the voters happier, right? Like, what can we do to sort of, we've gotten this very, very clear message from the voters that they want big changes. And now the president, as presidents tend to do, is proposing big changes, and the Senate and the House and the business community, and everybody will have to decide kind of how they want to respond, and we'll have negotiations, just like we do when we change policies. It has been a long time for a lot of us since we had real debates over domestic policy and trade policy in the United States. But any of us who lived through the 80s can remember sort of the long-running battle between the Reagan people and the Democrats over what the economy was going to look like. Now we're kind of going to go through something like that again. So that, I think, is basically what's happening. President, as presidents tend to do, is staking out a fairly ambitious line in terms of saying what he would like. And we're going to find out how much of that he's able to get, right? And that involves negotiations with the Hill. It involves dealing with the courts. It involves dealing with the business community. It involves seeing how the markets respond. It involves seeing how the voters respond. And of course, it involves, dealing with other countries. So now that the president is kind of laying out his preference and his thought in terms of how trade should work, other people can come back and respond and see what changes, if any, they're willing to put on the table. I don't think it's going to be viable to sort of come to the table and say, we really want to go back to 2015. We thought that was working great. I think that ship has sailed. So I think people need to kind of be thinking about what do they want. In the middle of all this discussion, Ambassador Lighthizer, I think, has put forward a potentially very helpful piece. People forget that in the 1970s and in the 1980s, everybody acts as though GATT was just this sort of machine that ran of itself. But that's not actually true. Throughout that time period, whenever the US started to run trade deficits that were politically destabilizing, whether it was in the early 70s under Nixon when it brought down the Bretton Woods system, or in the mid 80s when we had the whole scare about Japan, the G7 countries did a really good job of using economic diplomacy to take some of this tension out of the global trading system and to make changes that tended to bring the US economy back into balance. Now, we've abandoned that. Nobody does that anymore. Nobody tries to do that. We don't have negotiations over currency. We don't have negotiations over the trade balance. We don't have negotiations over any of this stuff. The trade deficit is seen as just a US and a US only problem. And so that's one of the reasons I think you're seeing the president act in a more unilateral ways. But what Ambassador Lighthizer is suggesting is, it doesn't have to be this way. You could create a process whereby there would be an understanding that, first of all, only certain countries get to have untrammeled access to the US market. And that, second of all, if you are running these very, very high trade surpluses, then there will be a mechanism by which to deal with that. The idea behind such a process would be to take away some of this political tension that results from the never-ending trade deficits and to alleviate some of these problems that we're hearing about from the voters. It will be interesting to see if anybody sort of picks up on that and offers a process like that or a suggestion like that to the president. It's a little disappointing to me, I think, that the rest of the world has been so unwilling to recognize the political problems that trade is causing in the United States, and that we really see no serious efforts from anybody to try to help us address some of these problems. And maybe Ambassador Lighthizer's suggestion is something that other countries may want to look at.
Okay, I'll come back with some questions, but let me turn it over to Arancha, since you are our European guest. And thank you for joining us late in your evening. How would you respond to not only what Steve just said, but kind of to this Ambassador Lighthizer idea of creating a new trade regime? And maybe you can explain to us about why the EU is so fixated with the WTO and WTO rules to the point where it's made it difficult for us to even work with the EU going forward, given that the gaps in our views on all of these issues seems to be getting wider, not smaller. Over to you, Arancha.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you tonight with lots of great people that I've been working with and for so many years of my life. And let me tell you that this is, seen from Europe, a critical conversation. And I will say why it is critical. We are in Europe, we knew that in international trade, we had a huge geopolitical problem in trade called Russia, a country with which we've basically stopped trading. We had a trade problem with Chinese characteristics, which we share with the US. But now we have a trade problem with US characteristics. And this is, let me try to explain what we see and why it's difficult for us in Europe to understand exactly what is it that we're looking for. So when we look at the US, we see an economy that is roaring. We see the most performing economy in the world. We see an economy that is the best in class from a technological point of view, well ahead of anybody else, including Europe. We see an economy that is at full employment. We see an economy that is capable of sucking capital from all around the world to attract investments into the US. So we see a roaring lion. And when we look and talk to our US friends, they sound like a scared mouse. And this is what we don't understand. We don't understand where the problem lies. Not that we don't see there is a problem. We do see that there is a problem in the US. We see there is a resentment on big parts of the population about not having been able to hitch on the bandwagon of international trade. We see people that have been dispossessed. But when then we look at the remedies that are being offered to address that, we are a little bit at a loss. Because one day the problem is exchanging tariffs for Greenland. The next day is exchanging tariffs for the Panama Canal. Another day is exchanging tariffs for Canada. So we don't know. And I think this discussion is extremely important to understand where the problem lies and how we can together fix it. And let me tell you, I was listening to the previous conversation. What we are feeling now in Europe is a huge anxiety over our ally turning somewhat unpredictable. And I'm trying to be diplomatic, very unpredictable towards Europe. But so it's not a fixation on Europe not to want to sit down and discuss and negotiate. I think we've said this, you've heard this from all ministers, diplomats in Europe, but we do not understand what this game is about. And I think it's important to understand what the game is about in order to be able to make headways.
So thanks for that. Now let me turn to Todd, and maybe Todd, you can respond to some of Arancha's questions because, you know, she made some good points. Overall, our economy is doing well, but a lot of the problems is that the working class, the middle class doesn't feel like they are, and they feel like trade has not benefited them, or at least in ways that they had hoped for. Steve also mentioned the importance of our trade policy reflecting the input of our stakeholders. So maybe you can, share with us kind of your views on where we are and where we are headed, and what makes sense going forward in our trade policy and in the global trading system, given all of these dynamics.
Yeah, Wendy, thanks so much for the question, and thanks to Ken and the WITA team for organizing this great series of sessions today and tomorrow. I want to basically agree with the premise of the question, Wendy, that you started off with, as well as I think what a lot of the other panelists have said so far, which is that we really are at a juncture in trade policy. And I think that there are a few different kind of ideas or templates that are kind of coexisting with each other, none quite dominant, none quite commanding, a broad bipartisan, support, but all kind of, potential candidates for sort of like the new model. I think, on the one hand, you have sort of an older model that most of us were trained in of, sort of rules-based order and efficiency with a more limited role for government in determining sort of which industries survive or thrive in the economy. That's what a lot of the trade agreements and approach that we've studied in the past and implemented in the past has looked like. You have sort of a Biden gloss on that, which is more acknowledging that in an era of climate crisis and China competition, it's a luxury we can't afford any longer to have the government be completely neutral as to which industries survive or thrive, so that you're going to use, I would say, sort of an approach that's 90% industrial policy, 10% tariffs and trade measures as a way of sort of structuring those markets. I think with Trump, you have sort of a different model that's almost the reverse percentage, which is 90% tariffs, 10% industrial strategy, except on the days when Wall Street has his ear, in which case then Wall Street's kind of dominating the conversation. And sort of on any given day, it's hard to predict which strategy is going to be dominant. To maybe zero in a little bit on what I think that middle model, the more kind of Biden approach, the Biden answer to your questions are, and maybe what we might expect, going forward into 2026 and 2028 in terms of a new model. I think, I would sort of outline three core principles. One is that trade needs to be in service of your theory of economic growth, not the other way around. Now, on some level, that's not a new idea, but it has a particular implication when you are sort of executing a policy that's so industrial policy centric. So if you look at things like the electric vehicle tariffs, people would sort of ask, how can it be consistent with Biden's climate agenda to have 100% tariffs on electric vehicles? Part of the answer to that is that we have this industrial strategy that's investing billions, if not trillions, ultimately, of dollars into these sectors, and that it just doesn't make sense from a sort of fiduciary perspective to have that be overwhelmed by a flood of imports. It's some of the rethinking that happened around intellectual property under Biden, whether that's the COVID waiver, the approach to IT or to other sectors, where you're sort of trying to subject some of the posture that the U.S. is taking to some of the kind of more, frankly, precautionary principles that were common in Europe, more than in the U.S. in the past. I think a second principle is just leveraging the power of the U.S. consumer market to achieve public policy objectives that the U.S. has. I think you can see that, as on the last panel, they talked about some of the great successes of the rapid response mechanism under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, dozens of cases brought under the Biden years. And I think that really kind of showing what can happen when you have something that's quick and factory specific that, very directly raises the livelihoods of workers, but at the same time, without disrupting the overall flow of commerce, for the mostly good actors that we have in the economy. I think you also saw that in proposals with Europe around the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, which was, leveraging our joint purchasing power to sort of decarbonize an important sector. And then I think the third principle that I would lay out is just personnel as policy, and trying to make sure that that who we hire and how we structure government sort of reinforces those industrial, labor, and climate goals. Now, this might have been a more interesting conversation to have, or at least these points that I'm making, in a second Biden or a first Harris administration, where I think they would have been quite influential. But I think if we're trying to sort of discern like what might be a likely course for trade policy in the years to come, and sort of where this sort of very rickety ship might end up going, I think those would be some of the principles that I would lay out.
Ted, maybe I can turn it over to you. We've heard Todd provided kind of his view that the Biden trade policy was 90% industrial policy, maybe 10% tariffs. I know you're simplifying this, while with Trump, at least during the first 3 weeks, seems 90% tariffs, 10% industrial policy. Do you agree with that breakdown? And how should we be balancing industrial policy and, I'd say, a more active trade policy, whether market opening or punitive?
Yeah, I mean, I probably do agree with the characterization, but I might define what's happening a bit differently. I mean, part of the idea of this panel was to talk about big ideas and the future direction of the trading system. And, I think for all of the chaos, what we're seeing out of President Trump is a big idea, and it's an old one, right? It's the use of tariffs in the service of national power. That's part of the focus on trade deficits, right? Trade surpluses are an instrument of national power. That was the classic mercantilist idea that animated trade policies for much of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century. Our whole modern trading system was built in rejection of the mercantilist approach. A, because it didn't generate as much wealth as a more rules-based free market, for all its limitations, capitalist approach, and B, because it led to conflict. So I think, unfortunately, we are on the cusp of rerunning that experiment. I fault the Biden administration here a bit because they talked a good game, but they didn't really act on it. I mean, I think on the industrial policy side, there was a lot of good stuff. I mean, and you can talk about the IRA and chips and science. You can like aspects of it, not like aspects of it. A lot of the efforts to move interesting work opportunities into places that have been hurt by the global trading system, all that good stuff. But on the trade front, it was just rhetoric, right? The worker-centered trade policy. There was no worker-centered trade policy. There was no effort, for instance, to extend the USMCA model and its focus on labor rights, which got, Wendy, do you remember? I don't know, only 45 votes against it in the House. I mean, it was the most bipartisan trade agreement we have seen in decades. There was no effort to build on that accomplishment. Instead, there was this sort of deathly fear of any agreement that might include market access. So we weren't going to go out and try to negotiate anything. So there was a big vacuum that got left. And now I think, unfortunately, it's being filled with what are really rather archaic and potentially quite destructive ideas about the role of trade and tariffs. So we have a new model. I just think it's an old recycled model that didn't work before, and maybe somebody can persuade me it will work better in the 21st century than it worked in the 19th, but I don't think so.
So Todd, just back to you for a minute, because there were some comments that Ted made about Biden's worker-centered trade policy. I mean, how do you assess it? Because on one hand, it seemed to come out with a lot of fanfare and was going to really change things. But on the other hand, when we look at the accomplishments on trade under the Biden administration, they seem to be pretty modest. But I mean, over to you. Are there things we're missing? And maybe you can share with us, why was there a reluctance to enter into any new trade agreements, whether they be sectoral or, in other words, not even going forward with a comprehensive free trade agreement, but why weren't other agreements pursued, or were they and we forgot about them already?
Yeah, I mean, I think as the last panel, CJ Mahoney on the last panel pointed out, in a world where the US has such low bound tariffs, there is relatively little room to make, robust offers of the kind that we would have seen in previous decades of the GATT negotiations. So I think that limits to some extent the deal space that's available. I think, it's also just worth all of us remembering that we don't have, with all due respect to everyone in the room and all the hard work that you've done, there hasn't been an administration that's come along with a really robust agenda that's gotten through Congress in quite some time. I think that, the one exception is the USMCA, which Trump was able to get with, huge margins from both parties. And that, I think we have to sort of admit that at least some of that had to do with the credible threat that he might blow it up. And so there was, all the parties were willing to kind of come to the side, come together and negotiate. I think if you look at the Biden administration, there was a willingness to use some of US muscle when it comes to things like Ukraine or sort of big foreign policy initiatives. You didn't see the sort of same desire to use and front load the muscle when it came to other trade, whatever the foreign policy for the middle class was, or worker-centered trade policy. You saw these sort of enforcement actions, but you didn't see sort of big proposals to use any leverage that the U.S. might have to kind of get others on board. And I think it's also important from the U.S. perspective for us to just remember, even though, I think in the U.S. context, we have seen both sort of the right and the left of the political spectrum and the center move to a bit of a new consensus when it comes to economic policy. The same is not true globally around the world. And I think that, the appetite for sort of a quote unquote post-neoliberal trade agreement with our European allies, just it wasn't totally there. I think that, it's going to take longer to have some of that consensus that we've built domestically extend beyond U.S. borders. And I think, you know, one concrete example was what I would have considered the fairly low-hanging fruit of a sectoral agreement on steel and aluminum that just you know, was not able to get to a consensus in the available time frame.
Mhm. So Steve, over to you. In the executive order issued by the president a few weeks ago, he does ask, I believe, as USTR to come up with suggestions about either trade agreements with partners or sectoral trade agreements. And an earlier panel this afternoon focused on prospects for digital agreements, which were done during the first Trump term. Do you think we're going to see additional trade agreements during Trump's second term? And are we likely to see them more in the sectoral space? Or do you see any appetite for more comprehensive agreements?
Well, I don't think anybody really wants to do a comprehensive agreement with the United States right now. I mean, almost everybody has as much access to the U.S. market as they think they need. So I don't think there's a lot that people would be willing to give us in exchange for a comprehensive agreement. I think the only one who might really do that would be the UK. But my guess is that they're not going to be willing to take the agriculture and open their market to goods in a way that we would be interested in seeing. So I do think there's going to be a lot more conversations in the sectoral space. But a lot of this is going to be, look, we have a situation where most of our trading partners are very, very, very happy with the status quo, and the Americans are not very happy with the status quo. And so it makes it very difficult to get other countries to come to the table. I mean, I agree with, you know, some of the points that Todd was making. In other words, I certainly thought the Biden people put forward some very realistic and pragmatic options for the EU, for example, in how to deal with the steel and aluminum situation. And the Europeans just weren't very interested in having that conversation because they just felt like, you know, it would violate legal principles. So I think we'll have to kind of wait and see, you know, how much interest there is in other countries. But I think certainly, you know, if there's a deal out there that would be good for the U.S., I'm sure the administration would like to pursue those. But we don't, you know, there's just not much incentive on these other countries to work with us. I would like to make one other point, which is that in terms of kind of how we got the GATT and how it stayed stable for so long, I think we really do not give previous generations enough credit for all the good political work that was done, both in the US and in Europe, to convince the voters on both sides of the Atlantic that the trading system was a good idea. People, you know, Presidents Eisenhower and Truman and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and Ford and Carter and Reagan all spent a huge amount of time talking to the American people and responding to the Americans about concerns on trade. We did have a lot of trade disputes, which we had to work out. And I think what we basically tried was an experiment where we were going to abandon all of that, and we were going to basically have trade policy work like monetary policy and have it kind of all settled by experts, you know, behind closed doors. And I think that's failed. So I think trade's coming back into the policy space. And to me, that's a good thing. And I think we can certainly convince Americans of the benefits of a good trade policy, but we have to try.
And just a quick question, do you have any thoughts on where the Trump team might be on pursuing digital trade agreements? Might that be back on our agenda?
Well, I think certainly, you know, the whole digital trade is going to be a big issue, right? In other words, they're very, you know, as everybody knows, by the end of the first Trump administration, they were very angry with a lot of the things that were being done, especially in the EU toward our tech companies. President Trump has commented, you know, along those lines similarly. So I think, you know, and I heard in the last panel, I know Steve Verheuvel indicated that these other countries are fairly dug in on some of those positions. So I think we're going to see some fairly intense negotiations with respect to what happens in the tech sector. And that could eventually lead to digital.
So Arancha, over to you. We've heard a couple of speakers refer to the failed steel negotiations between the US and Europe during the Biden administration. And this was going to be, in some ways, a different type of trade deal going forward, which in my understanding included a new external tariff against certain countries, including one big non-market economy. But Europe was unwilling to conclude this deal. One of the reasons is it felt like it did not live up to the WTO rule. It did not, it didn't live up to the WTO rules. Is that a fair characterization? And is Europe like ready to sit down with the United States and look at new creative approaches, even if it means that, you know, some of these, the WTO principles, which seem to be quite outdated at this point, can, you know, are called into question?
Yeah, but let me answer with another question. Where would the EU be today with an agreement with the US, with the previous administration on steel and aluminum to just face again another tariff of 25%? Rules.
But at that point, you didn't know it.
That's right. But you know, it makes it all even more, it makes it all even a little bit more questionable. Let's say that we don't have a fixation with rules. We have a fixation for having a stability in our trade relationship, which doesn't mean that we don't take good fights. I started my career as a trade lawyer fighting against the US, and it was great and it was normal, because in a great, solid, strong trade relationship, it's normal that you have these agreements and then you fight it out, and in the end you try to settle it. So let's say that Europe is not obsessed with the WTO. Europe prefers to have rules of the game that gives it a bit of stability. Also because the EU as such is a rules-based creature, right? So we have this dynamic within the EU, which is in a way what gives us a preference for having a bit of stability. But if I look at our economies today, Wendy, and this is the thing that in my view we have to look at a little bit, our economies today are to a very large extent services economies. And tariffs have nothing to do with services economies. It's all about regulatory frameworks. And this is where agreements on digital, agreements on safety and security of value chains, agreements on security of procurement for raw materials become so much more important in our economies today. So, you know, in a way, the tariff game is yesterday's game. And the game today and tomorrow is more how do we give more space for these services economy that, by the way, is the part of international trade that is massively growing everywhere, to have more opportunities for trade between ourselves and with others. And again, in my view, this is a more promising avenue than hitting each other on the head with tariffs.
Mm-hmm. And a quick question for you. There is a lot of talk about reciprocal tariffs here. And when we talk about them, the last panel even pointed to the low US tariff rate on autos at 2.5%. Europe's at 10%. Any chance that Europe would come down as part of a negotiation with the United States?
So is there a deal that can be made? Is there a deal where the EU finds something that the EU likes and gets, and the US finds something that the US wants and gets? You know, yeah. I mean, on automobiles, we've got a difference in tariffs. Mind you, a huge part of the auto investments in the US are also European companies that are heavily invested. And if I look at trade in autos, is relatively small compared. It's a very regionalized market, let's say, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Northern America, or whether it's in Asia around China. But, you know, can we have a sit down? Are there other products that where the US tariffs are higher? Let's look at some agricultural products, processed agricultural products, where the tariffs are higher on the US side, the tariffs are lower on the EU side, because we are assuming that this reciprocal is only to go up. Let's imagine that the reciprocal is to go down. I mean, I think if we were to sit down, I'm sure we would be able to find a deal on the down rather than on the up.
Okay. Spoken like a true negotiator. Okay. Ted, over to you. A few speakers have kind of hinted that other countries, that given our tariffs are so low, that there's very little that they want from us. Do you agree with that assessment? Because at least my years at USTR suggested that there were a lot of other areas that were really important to countries, including the overall seeking certainty and predictability. But they had a lot of requests in a lot of different areas. So interested in your views there.
Yeah, I mean, I must say I agree with you, Wendy. I think, access to the US market is so important that very small gains in terms of tariff reductions, if they're combined with other measures that offer greater certainty of access or better coordination on regulatory barriers and things like that, I think are still very attractive. We didn't really test that at all in the last administration. I was hoping that would happen in IPEF. But it didn't. Well, one thing I'd like to say related to all this, I actually quite agree with Stephen on the gap model. I think when the history books are written on this, the WTO will come to be seen as a utopian project in much the way the League of Nations was, as a step too far that tread on national sovereignty, something at the end of the day politically wasn't sustainable. But if you look at what was done, at the end of the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, with the neutering of the dispute settlement system, in many ways, we had already moved back to a GATT type system where there was no binding authority left in the WTO. When there were disagreements, they had to be negotiated out. There were opportunities for doing deals outside the system, be it, the US deals with China or the US deal with Japan or all the agreements the EU has negotiated. What puzzles me is where we're going now. I think already effectively we are back at the GATT system. And when I read Ambassador Lighthizer editorial talking about how we have to blow everything up and start with a brand new negotiation, I really don't quite understand that. I mean, effectively, we're already back at the GATT. So why can't we kind of learn to live with that and go forward, instead of saying we have to blow more things up? The only sense I can make of it is some conviction in Trump world that chaos works to the benefit of the United States. That if investors are scared enough, if there's enough uncertainty, Arancha talked about the importance of stability, that money will flow into the United States. I'm not sure that's a good bet. I think there's a very good chance that money will stop flowing to lots of places, so we'll have a more generalized recessionary kind of environment, or that companies could well say, well, there are other countries who are still part of this broader trading system, willing to create that kind of stability. Maybe we'll go invest there instead. So I'm just still a little puzzled by where it is that these new initiatives are trying to take us. Sorry to keep hitting the same note, but I think it's top of all of our minds right now, trying to make sense of what is it that the president is trying to do here. Is there a game plan that makes any kind of sense, and it gives us a kind of blueprint for thinking about where the system moves next?
Mm-hmm. And Steve, that is one of the questions in the chat, so maybe I can turn it over to you. What is the overarching strategy of our trade policy now? As I get it, we're just a few weeks into Trump 2.0, but how would you articulate it? And I guess my other question for you would be, well, do you want to respond to any of
Sure.
Ted's?
I mean, yeah. So let me just a couple of things. First of all, first of all, I've never. A lot of you guys have more experience negotiating trade deals than I do. I don't have as much experience as the rest of y'all, perhaps, but I mean, I never heard of a negotiation where somebody comes in and says, okay, here's my end point. This is where I intend to go. And I'm going to tell you what my bottom line is, like before we start the negotiations. I mean, that's not usually how negotiations work, right? I mean, I think expecting the president to come out and say, here's what I want the whole global trading system to look like, when I leave office. I just don't think that's very realistic. And I don't think that would be a good tactic on his part. And I don't think that's something that he should do. I just want to make one other correction. I don't think Mr. Lighthizer was suggesting anything about blowing up anything. I think what he was saying is that the original system was designed under the idea that currencies would adjust and trade balances would sort of take care of themselves. That turned out not to be true. Maybe we should think to have more of a mechanism where that would work. And then I think the other thing he was talking about is we have some non-market economies in the current system, and maybe we should not have those companies in countries in the system. So I think I think that proposal is actually pretty easy to follow. But I think in terms of, what I think is going to happen, I think what's President Trump trying to do? He's trying to get a global trading system, or at least a set of U.S. trading relationships. That's the better way to put it. He would like our trade policy to contribute to the prosperity of the United States. He would like to think that our trade policy meant that we got more wages and higher jobs. I mean, higher wages and more jobs and expanding production and expanding growth. He believes that the current policies are hurting American workers, that net, they are worse off than they would be under his proposed different rules. And I think until you understand that, you won't understand any of the things that he's doing. If you think that the current system is working well, then obviously it doesn't make sense to change it. He thinks it's a disaster, and he thinks we could do much better. So he thinks if I put in these tariffs, that will lead to a happier and more prosperous United States. Some people disagree, but that is his belief. Now, it's also possible that once he's put in the tariffs, you may come in and offer him something that he likes even better than the tariffs, and then he would consider that. But the goal here is quite straightforward. You know how all those voters have been unhappy and yelling and screaming about the trade system for years? Let's make those voters happy. Let's have them stop yelling. Let's have them stop complaining. And let's have them believe that they are competing on a level playing field and that they are doing better. That's the goal.
And how about the tools? Because, everyone's so focused on tariffs now. The last panel did talk about, in the context of the USMCA review, the need to look at rules of origin. And I think USTR designate Greer also talked about rules of origin, strengthening rules of origin during his testimony. Are there other tools like rules of origin that can be used to, achieve our trade policy
Look,
goals?
I think we can learn a lot from Europe and Japan and Korea in this regard. In other words, you can use standards, you can use, all kind of, you can use. The Europeans are very good at saying, if you want to sell something in the EU, it has to be made to EU standards. If it's not made to EU standards, it can't be sold here. We went through a lot of this when we looked at how hard it is to sell automobiles into Korea or how hard it is to sell automobiles into Japan. They have a very strict licensing regime and standards regime that you can use. There's a lot of different tools in the toolbox, but you do have to find some way so that you get leverage, so that when you sit down with these other countries, they have reasons to come to the table. And going back to Ted's point, of course, and going to your other point, of course, other countries would like more from the United States, but that's not really the issue. The issue is, are they willing to make a deal, right? In other words, if you come to them and say, we're running these huge trade deficits, we would really like to have things be more balanced, they don't really have much of an incentive to work with us right now. And they're not working with us. And they did not work with the Biden administration. And I think Catherine Tai and her team tried really, really, really hard to get the rest of the world to come to the table, and they just wouldn't do it. So, President Trump's going to try a different approach.
So, Arancha, let me bring you into this discussion. Is that a fair assessment of the EU-US relationship in recent years?
So let me tell you what the EU has done in just these last few months. Probably feeling that the wind was changing on the US side, and with a number of partners that probably felt that the wind was changing on the US side. The EU has concluded its trade agreement with Mercosur, then renegotiation with Mexico, the renegotiation with Switzerland. It has resumed negotiations with Malaysia, and it's doing that with the Philippines and with Thailand. I have no doubt in my mind that should the EU feel that the US was in the mood for a trade negotiation, there could be a negotiation. And I really do think that it would be a much more intelligent avenue to pursue. It's at the end of the day, what worries me of the present circumstances, Wendy, to be quite honest, is that I see that none of the things that are being put on the table to resolve the problems of the US deficit, if the trade deficit in the US is a problem, will work. So I think maybe we explore the things that may end up working, and not hurting, which is what will end up happening, both the US as well as Europe in this case, and many others.
So we have about 9 minutes left, and we really haven't talked about China at all. We talked about a non-market economy, but not China. And we all know, I think we'd all believe that China, when China joined the WTO and the years after, it really kind of changed the dynamic of the global trading system. That's probably an understatement. Ted, a question for you. When you look at I'm not going to ask you did we make a mistake in letting China join the WTO? I guess the question is, as long as China now is a member of the WTO, and not just China, but other countries as well, and consensus on any new agreements is just so hard to find. Don't other groupings make sense then? Shouldn't we be trying to work more with like-minded countries, either in like an arrangement along the lines of what Lighthizer has put forward, or through some of these supply chain agreements? And as a result, do you think the world's going to become more fragmented, and countries are going to have to choose at some point in which basket they want to be in?
I actually might defer to Todd on this, because the industrial policy stuff, that was a lot of the thinking behind it, I think, was we needed a different approach to China. And I'd be interested in Todd's thoughts about where that might go in an administration that's perhaps a little more amenable to it than the current one.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Todd,
huge
over
question.
to you.
Yeah, I mean, huge question. I mean, I think that, one of, I think one of the, if you look at sort of the early 2000s and the early 2010s, I think that a lot of the US, hope was that basically by bringing China into the benefits of sort of liberalized commerce, that there would also be liberalization of the overall political system. And I think that just, obviously did not happen. I think Made in China 2025 getting announced in 2015, sort of around the time as Trump was coming down the elevator at Trump Tower. I think these were sort of signals at the same time that both countries were moving in a different direction. And I think, you had sort of folks that once upon a time, like Marco Rubio and others, that were, sort of fairly free trade oriented, kind of moving in a direction of wanting to retool the US policy package to, if not imitate China, at least sort of do a US version of kind of an all of government approach to industrial strategy. And I think that, that's kind of now become kind of a structural feature of the bilateral relationship, that, I think that whether it's 90% tariffs, 10% industrial strategy, or 90%, 10% the other way, I think you will continue to see sort of leaders of both parties try to pursue that agenda as a way of kind of just, locking in competitive advantages for the decades to come. And I think that, again, sort of even if the Trump team doesn't use the word C to talk about climate much, they are going to use the other C word, China, for many of the same industries where there's going to be sort of strategic gains for whichever country has the first mover advantage. And I think, this is like an area where it would be really useful if there's just a little bit more honesty from all parties, including the Trump administration, on sort of what exactly they hope to accomplish with tariffs. I think that, one of the concessions that we've seen in public debates recently is that there is a role for tariffs. I think that, the classic role for tariffs is the infant industry argument of trying to sort of give temporary protection as a way of building a competitive advantage. That's not something that across the board tariffs are going to do effectively. That's not even what they're, really what they're designed to do. So I think just being a little bit more open that is, that there is a cost to tariffs. It does raise the price of imported goods, and that is in fact the point of doing them, so that domestic industry can become more competitive. So I think that overall, it would just be beneficial to hear sort of a little bit more of a leaning into the actual arguments, of which there are, as I've outlined, a number of reasons to use tools like tariffs. But it would be just better for everyone if we were a little bit more open about what we're trying to do.
Like more targeted, and yeah. Yeah. Steve, over to you, because you were at USTR during the negotiation and an active member of the team of the phase 1 trade deal with China. Do you see any prospects of a phase 2 negotiation being launched during Trump's tenure?
Yeah, I think it's very likely that there will be some type of negotiation with China. I think they will want, I mean, they've already said in the memorandum, they're going to take a look at phase 1 and they're going to see how China did in terms of complying with that agreement. They've already put some more tariffs in, and China's responding with counter tariffs. So I think it's very likely you're going to see more negotiations there. And I think one of the questions that the Americans are going to be trying to figure out is, are we better off working with other countries on the China issue, or are we better off just trying to resolve this ourselves and making our own deal with China? And I think to some extent that's going to depend on if we work with other countries, are we going to get a lot of benefits from that, or is it a situation where other countries are kind of just looking to play us and China off against each other in the hopes of getting more and more concessions from the U.S.? I don't think you're going to see the U.S. making a lot of concessions to other countries in order to get help with China. I think you're going to see the Trump administration be more willing to just take care of the China issue on its own, as opposed to paying other people to work with us. But going back to your point, Wendy, that may open the door. I totally agree with Ted on the whole League of Nations analogy. I think that's actually really, really a good way to think about it. I mean, I don't think anybody.
What, that the WTO can become like a League of Nations?
The WTO is very much like the League of Nations, right? And in other words, I mean, there were certainly by the late 60s, 70s, I don't think anybody thought that the United Nations was going to be a realistic constraint on the Soviet Union. I think people understood we had to work through other channels. And I think that's kind of where we are with China right now. So I think as long as China kind of is where it is, I think the WTO is basically sidelined. So I think the Americans will they will certainly be interested in hearing what other countries have to say on the China issue, but they're going to be basically conducting, they're going to be talking to China and they're going to be talking to other countries, and they'll just kind of have to see, which way those negotiations go.
One new development since the phase 1 talks, we've seen a lot of Chinese companies move into third countries to avoid tariffs. Is this something that would need to be addressed in any type of, and how do we address that with China? Do you address it more with third countries or with China?
I think they'll do both. So I think they'll take a look at the 301 tariffs and see if there are things they can do in terms of rules of origin and things of that nature to address some of the China issues. I definitely think that's going to be on their radar screen. But certainly, for example, if Canada and Mexico want to have an FTA with the United States, I think they have to think about their rules with respect to FDI from China. I don't think the Americans are going to let you have an FTA so that China can use your country as a platform to get around, these tariffs and attack the U.S. market. So I think it's going to come up in almost every context.
Okay, I think, Ken, we're at the closing point, I think.
Indeed, we are. It's been a heck of a conversation. Wendy, I can allay your fears. We stayed over 200 for most of the day. 200 people were online
Thank you.
all the day, and most of them stuck around for this. Now, I gotta say, I'm not sure what it says about this conversation, but I'm reminded of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, when he wrote that in the midst of chaos, there's always opportunity. I read that to mean that when a situation appears completely disordered and turbulent, there's still a potential for positive change, growth, and advantages to be found in that chaos, essentially that a crisis can sometimes present unexpected openings for new possibilities. I'm an optimist, so always looking for those new possibilities. And what's very clear to me is that more dialogue is important, and we'll keep searching here at WITA for opportunities to bring the U.S. and international trade communities together. In fact, we've launched WITA International, if that's not too much of a double saying it, WITA International, to bring the two communities together and help bridge the gap in dialogue between the U.S. and global trade policy makers. So thank you for this very robust and informative conversation. Thanks for sticking with us, everybody who did. Tomorrow we'll kick things off in person with a networking breakfast at 9:30 a.m. in the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. And then we'll go live with our first session, both online and in person at 10 a.m. Eastern time today. Thanks to this panel. Really grateful to you for joining us today, Arancha, especially so late in the evening in the City of Light. Tomorrow we kick things off, as I said, at 10 a.m. For anyone who registered for the conference, you'll receive a link to watch via Zoom. And we hope those of you in DC will join us in person. If you're watching online Tuesday, you should have received a reminder from Zoom today with the link for tomorrow. And you'll get another reminder again tomorrow before the session starts. Please remember that's a different link than we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you, Arancha, Steve, and Todd, and Ted.